By the end of a summer that cracked the clay open like old skin, the hill behind Shady Grove Church had settled into odd shapes, a tired graveyard shifting as if something beneath it exhaled. When a sudden windstorm peeled dust from the mounds, 22 small rises split along the crowns and let out the smallest secrets. A curl of hair the color of wheat, a braid tied with faded blue thread, a coiled lock black as heron feather, and beside each, a careful stack of teeth laid in a little smile that did not belong to a skull. No bones pressed up through the soil, no finger joints, no long shank of a leg or round dome of a child's head, only hair and enamel, soft and hard, tenderness and bite, arranged like offerings in a language no one wanted to read. Deputy Jonah Bell stood with his hat in his hand, and a pencil tucked behind his ear, and wrote what the earth would allow him to write. 22. Hair present, teeth counted by tens, no remains. He did not write what the wind said when it ran through the churchyard cedars, that it sounded like a low hum, like a mouth held closed while speaking. He did not write that the little stacks were too neat to be the work of chance, or that some locks had been twisted into tight cords as if trained to obey. He measured the distances between the mounds and saw they were even in a way that felt like a lesson, single arm's lengths repeating down the row, small bodies laid with a ruler. He walked the slope and felt the ground dip hard where the clay had been tamped long ago. A firm pat that said someone had knelt and pressed and smoothed and taken pride. The churchwomen came with baskets and questions and prayers said too loud, and the men came with shovels they pretended were for kindness. And Jonah told them to wait, told them the law would decide, told them that the dead are not served by hurry. Under the sun, the hair lifted and fell in little waves. The teeth glowed like seeds. A farmer said animals had done it, but there were no scratch marks. And even animals do not stack what they steal. And another man said children do wicked things. But no child he knew would leave the ground this clean. As the crowd thinned, Jonah knelt again and found a ribbon end like a tongue under one mound, and a smear of wax under another, pale and sweet-smelling, as if a candle had burned not for grief but for instruction. He thought of ledgers he had seen in the courthouse, names crossed out in thin ink with the word moved, and he thought of the doctor in town who kept drawers of molars as if saving for a winter. He told himself he would not think like that, he would not name a house before proof forced him to, yet he could not help seeing the order in the mess, could not help seeing hands at work that loved quiet. He covered the splits with cloth and set a watch and wrote a final line at the bottom of his page. Return at dawn. Speak to no one. Follow the pattern back to its maker. Down the road, the evening light pressed flat across still water, and a house waited with closed shutters that had never needed a lock. It waited the way a jar waits on a shelf, alone. The house on Stillwater Road did not look different from the other farmsteads scattered across that stretch of Kentucky clay, but people said it felt cleaner, quieter, somehow more careful. Ephraim Nash carried himself with the gravity of a man who had known hardship, but learned to tame it with prayer and order. Each Sunday evening, neighbors came to his barn where lanterns burned steady and voices lifted in hymns. He spoke without fire, never raising his voice, telling them that sin was not loud, that the devil entered through disorder, through dirt, through loosened tongues. Those who gathered felt calmed in his presence, as if standing in the shade of a wide oak. It was a comfort many mistook for goodness, yet beneath the stillness his eyes carried the cold insistence of a man who measured each breath others took. Temperance Nash was the gentler face of the household, a woman whose hands smelled faintly of starch and roses, whose hair was always pinned neat. She offered tea to grieving widows, bread to mothers with many mouths to feed, and chairs to weary travelers. Her craft was a strange one, but accepted in a time when mourning was its own industry. She made wreaths of human hair, intricate loops and flowers woven from the cut locks of the living and the dead. Families brought her clippings, trusting her to transform them into keepsakes. She would tell them it was a way to bind memory into permanence, to make sure no soul slipped away entirely. She displayed these wreaths in frames, hung them in halls, gave them back to weeping hands. No one questioned how much hair she seemed to keep for herself, or how her collection never thinned. The Nash house was always open, but it was never free. To sit at their table meant bowing your head when Ephraim prayed, eating in silence except for the sound of chewing, and listening when he spoke about obedience being the highest form of love. Children in particular were watched closely. They were praised for sitting still, corrected when their eyes wandered, scolded gently if they spoke without being spoken to. Guests told themselves these were only the rules of a devout home, nothing more. But in their memories it lingered, the way Ephraim tapped his spoon once before anyone lifted theirs, the way Temperance smiled with approval only when mouths stayed closed. What stood out most was the cleanliness. Floors scrubbed until bare wood seemed white, windows wiped until no smear of daylight showed. Neighbors joked the Nashes could eat supper off their porch boards, but beneath the laughter was unease. Cleanliness at that level felt less like pride and more like punishment, as if even dust itself was not allowed to breathe in their rooms. Children visiting to deliver eggs or fetch milk remembered the sting of soap on their fingers when Temperance washed them twice at the pump, saying cleanliness made God love the body. And so the Nash family's reputation was built, kind, careful, charitable, a house where the grieving could weep, where the hungry could eat, where the sick could rest. Yet everyone also remembered that once you stepped inside, you felt smaller. You spoke less, you obeyed more. Something in the air pressed against the will made even grown men fold their hands like children at catechism. It was not shouted or forced. It was simply the rule of the house, as natural as breathing. Those who left at night carried a strange weight, the sense that their silence had been trained. And on the hill where 22 graves would one day rise, the ground had already begun to remember the quiet. The room at the back of the Nash house was called the wreath room, though neighbors whispered it smelled less like flowers and more like something bitter beneath them. The air was always sharp with lye, a sting that burned the nose, layered with the faint sweetness of roses drying on racks. Temperance Nash said the lye kept away rot, that roses masked grief, but there was something in the blend that clung to visitors' clothes long after they left, as though sorrow itself had soaked into the fabric. The room was her sanctuary, where she worked with patience that never faltered, weaving strands of human hair into wreaths, crosses, and circles meant to honor the departed. Families trusted her with locks cut from the dead, but Temperance went further. She told mothers to clip hair from the living too, children especially, saying it kept misfortune at bay. A lock placed on her shelf, she insisted, meant a soul was spared from sickness or storm. Children came willingly at first, sent with scissors and small satchels, their mothers telling them to give a clipping and receive a coin or sweet in return. They sat on the stool by the door while Temperance unwrapped her ribbons and tied their offerings with careful fingers. She would smile, tell them they had done a holy thing, and slip a peppermint into their palm. They left lighter, pockets lined with pennies, mouths sweetened but always with a strange itch on the back of their necks, as if something was missing that could not grow back. Some came back again and again, bringing her hair not just from their own heads but snipped from siblings while they slept, convinced that more ribbons meant more luck. Slowly, the wreath room filled with bundles, hundreds of strands tied into loops, dried into curls, or braided thin as thread. The shelves groaned with her quiet work. Frames of wreaths stood waiting to be delivered, while on the tallest shelf sat her private book, bound not in paper but in cloth sewn thick. Inside it, ribbons marked with initials were stitched directly into the binding. Each bore a date, a color, and often a number. How many inches of hair, how many clippings given. The strands were sorted by age and season, a cold ledger of years disguised as craft. Temperance turned its pages like scripture, fingertips brushing the soft chords as though reading them. She spoke of them as if they were alive, saying this one was faithful, that one was strong, another too weak and needing more offerings. When questioned, she would only say that the Lord's work was measured in patience. That hair was the part of the body that never stopped growing, even after the grave. The children's laughter faded from the doorway in time. Some parents stopped sending them, uneasy with how pale they looked afterward, how they complained of headaches or sudden chills. But Temperance always had another visitor, another mourner eager for her skill, another parent persuaded that her wreaths preserved memory. To step into that room was to feel time stop, the air heavy with soap, roses and something metallic faint as blood rinsed from iron. Every lock she tied was an act of quiet control, every ribbon a claim written into her hidden book. The neighbors thought of her as a kind woman tending to grief, yet within her wreath room she was archiving something deeper, a record not of love, but of ownership. And while hair hung like vines from her shelves, the ground beyond Stillwater waited for the bodies that hair no longer belonged to. Silas Pruitt came to the house on Stillwater Road on a mild spring evening, his boots dusty from the mail road, and his manners smooth enough to pass any doorstep. He carried little more than a black leather case, long and narrow, polished from use and smelling faintly of cloves and iron. He told Ephraim Nash he was a dentist's apprentice traveling between towns, offering charity dentistry to families who could not afford a physician's hand. Ephraim, always keen to host men who spoke softly and moved with purpose, welcomed him into the kitchen and cleared a place at the table. The boarder bowed his head at prayer, ate sparingly, and left behind no crumbs. Temperance liked him immediately, for he did not laugh or chatter, but watched her work with steady eyes as though he respected the order of her home. Within days, Silas set up his practice by the hearth. He spread a cloth, unbuckled his black case, and revealed rows of instruments that gleamed even in dim light. Slim hooks, pliers with narrow jaws, a tiny hammer, a box of powders that smelled sweet and sharp. He told neighbors he would pull aching teeth, clean blackened gums, and polish smiles, all for nothing but their thanks. Children were brought in with swollen jaws, farmers with abscesses, mothers with molars that kept them from sleep. Silas worked with a gentleness that unsettled more than comforted, whispering that pain was a test, that silence made the work holy. When the tooth finally gave way, he smiled in quiet triumph, lifting it into the light as if it were a coin. He placed most in jars, but some he slipped into his pocket, explaining to Ephraim that he needed samples for his training. The house soon smelled of clove oil and boiled metal, an odor that clung to the rafters and mixed with the ever-present tang of lye. Neighbors swore by his skill, grateful that their children's cries ended quickly, though they noticed the way he counted teeth like a banker, rolling them between his fingers, arranging them into piles as if measuring worth. He spoke often to Ephraim about cleanliness, saying that a clean smile reflected a clean soul. Decay, he warned, was not only in the gums, but in the spirit, and if a man let rot spread in his mouth, it proved his heart was no better. Ephraim nodded, pleased with such talk, repeating it later in his barn prayers as though it were scripture. The kitchen became a place of strange gatherings where suffering was endured under a practiced hand, and relief came only through extraction. Some left lighter, their pain eased, yet others left feeling hollow, uneasy at what had been taken. A few returned weeks later with their mouths still sore, gums strangely slow to heal. but Silas reassured them that healing was a long obedience. Temperance stood nearby during his work, sometimes collecting the clippings of gauze stained with red, as though even waste belonged to her careful order. By summer, the Nashes and their boarder worked in a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. Hair tied in the back room, teeth pulled in the kitchen, prayers in the barn. Each act seemed separate to the neighbors, yet beneath it all was a growing sense that everything was being gathered, counted, and kept. The black case snapped shut each night with a sound sharp as a lock. And though he slept in the spare room upstairs, the smell of cloves and iron seeped through the house, as if to remind everyone inside that the measure of a soul could be held between forceps and placed neatly in a pocket. Behind the Nash house, past the rows of beans and the line of whitewashed fence, stood a well that no longer drew water. Its stones were old, the mortar cracked, but Ephraim had fitted it with a fresh pulley and a curious contraption. A hollow tin horn fixed along the rim, its mouth angled downward into the shaft. He told visitors it was no longer for drinking but for cleansing. He said the well carried warmth from the earth itself, and that if the sick leaned into it and breathed deep, the air would burn out whatever plagued them. More than that, he claimed the horn was God's gift, that it made voices carry pure so that when the unclean sang into the dark, their songs rose again polished and free of sin. To a people eager for cures, his words carried weight, and few dared argue with a man who spoke them with such calm authority. Neighbors began sending children to the cleansing place, often those too weak for school or too restless to sit through prayer. The ritual was simple on the surface. The child was sat in the bucket, lowered by rope into the cool shaft, and instructed to sing, hymns first, then any tune they knew. From above, the family would hear the voice echo through the horn, strange and hollow but clear, filling the yard with music. Ephraim told them the sound itself proved the sickness was leaving, that the well swallowed weakness and returned strength. The neighbors nodded, soothed by the spectacle, though something in the echo clung to them afterward. The notes seemed stretched, flattened, as though the earth itself was reshaping the voices into something less human. It was on a late afternoon in August that Jonas Pike, a boy of 7 with a cough that kept his mother awake at night, was lowered into the bucket. His mother stood wringing her hands while Ephraim kept a firm hold on the rope, his face calm as stone. At first, Jonas sang strong, the words of Rock of Ages rising up through the tin, soft and warped but still sweet. The neighbors gathered at the fence smiled, whispering that the child might at last be healed. Yet as the bucket went lower, the sound changed. His voice trembled, broke, then steadied again, but thinner now, as though he was far beneath the earth. Ephraim told the mother not to worry, that the deeper one went, the more sin was drawn out. Then came a silence. The rope jerked once, slackened and stilled. Ephraim pulled slowly, too slowly, as though testing weight, his eyes never leaving the horn. The neighbors leaned forward, listening hard, and for a moment they swore they heard something else. Not Jonas, but a lower hum, long and steady, vibrating against the tin like a second voice hidden beneath the first. When the bucket finally rose, it was empty. Ephraim said the boy had slipped, but his words were calm, too calm, as he pulled the rope again and again, finding nothing but air. The mother screamed, but Temperance put her arms around her shoulders and whispered that the well takes only what is weak, and that her son's song was proof he had gone clean into God's hands. By dusk the crowd had scattered, but the sound lingered in their minds, that last hum, deep and unnatural, as if the well itself had swallowed the hymn whole and kept it. The rope was wound tight, the bucket set upright, and Ephraim knelt by the stones in prayer, though his lips did not move. That night neighbors swore they heard faint singing from Stillwater Road, drifting with the wind, too low to know the words. The well stood silent, its horn aimed at the ground, waiting for the next voice to fill it. Lydia Crane kept her ledger as carefully as a preacher keeps his Bible. Every child who passed through her one-room schoolhouse had a place there, names inked in steady hand, columns marked for attendance, lessons, and progress. She believed the ledger told the truth of a town, who thrived and who faltered, who belonged and who drifted away. But by the spring of 1856, she began to notice something that unsettled her. Names were vanishing, not with smudges or hurried scratches, but crossed out in thin, precise strokes of ink. Next to them appeared short notes in unfamiliar hand, moved, taken to kin, too weak. The phrases were exact, repeated as if from a script. At first, she thought it must be her own oversight, a mistake made in exhaustion, yet the pattern grew. The children marked away were always at tender ages, 7, 9, 11, still bright, still restless, the kind who squirmed in benches but showed promise in the way they shaped letters or remembered sums. They were children who should not have disappeared so quietly. The unease grew heavy on her shoulders until one afternoon she closed her classroom early and carried the ledger up Stillwater Road. She told herself she sought counsel from Temperance Nash, a woman known for her wisdom and comfort. Perhaps Temperance had heard of families moving, of kin taking children to new farms, of illnesses that explained the word too weak. The house smelled of starch and roses when she entered, a sharp perfume that tightened her throat. Temperance greeted her with the warmth of a hostess, pressing her to sit, setting a pie to cool on the table. Lydia laid the ledger before her, pointing at the names, the notes that seemed written by another hand. Temperance smiled, running her finger along the margins as if caressing the children themselves. She told Lydia that the world takes the weak in its own time, that some are spared further suffering by leaving early. She said kin often call children away suddenly and mothers choose silence to hide grief. Then she pressed a plate of pie into Lydia's hand, the sweetness overpowering as though sugared too much. Lydia tried to press the matter further, asking if Temperance had heard where Jonas Pike had gone, or the Brewer twins, or little Ruthie North. But Temperance only shook her head gently and said, "God's order is not ours to question." Lydia felt foolish then, like a child scolded for speaking out of turn, and gathered her ledger quickly. As she rose to leave, Temperance slipped a thin ribbon between its pages, smiling that it would help her keep her place. Lydia walked home in the deepening dusk, trying to shake the feeling that her questions had been swallowed whole, her concerns smoothed flat like linen beneath Temperance's hands. It was not until she sat at her own desk by lamplight that she noticed the ribbon more closely. Pale, almost white, soft in a way that cloth never was. At one end, a knot held together a small bundle of strands, hair tied and pressed flat, initials stitched faintly in thread she did not remember sewing. She ran her fingers along it and felt her scalp prickle as though touched. She searched her memory, trying to recall when she had allowed anyone to cut her hair. But the thought would not settle. A chill ran through her as she realized she could not account for the missing strands. Uneasy, she tied the ribbon to a nail on her wall, unable to keep it inside her book, yet equally unable to throw it away. That night she did not sleep, lying awake as the lamplight flickered and the ribbon swayed gently in the draught, as though stirred by a breath too quiet to hear. The kitchen filled with the smell of melted tallow, thick and sweet, clinging to the air like grease on cloth. Temperance Nash moved with steady hands, pouring the hot wax into shallow molds she had set across the table. What made them peculiar were the rims, lined with teeth collected by Silas, each pressed upright into the edge so that when the wax cooled, a jagged smile would frame the candle. She told the neighbors these were smiling lights, holy lamps that pushed back storms and drove off misfortune. To see the finished Rao with their pale wax faces and rings of enamel was to feel unsettled, though no one dared say so aloud. In a county where weather ruined crops and sickness swept through homes without warning, even the strangest promise of protection was accepted if spoken with confidence. She gathered the children most evenings, calling them her circle of blessings. They stood barefoot on the cool floorboards while the candles burned low, their strange smiles flickering against the walls. Each child was given a turn to step forward. Temperance lifted a taper, its flame small but steady, and held it close to their mouths. She whispered that heat-closed, lying lips that truth was drawn out by fire. Her voice was calm, never cruel, as if she were explaining a recipe. The children trembled but obeyed, leaning in just enough for the flame to brush their breath. Some pursed their lips tight, others whimpered, but all remained silent until she lowered the taper again. After each turn, she nodded with approval and told them they were safer now, their tongues kept pure. Silas stood in the corner with his case open, the metal glinting like a row of teeth of its own. He kept a small book in which he made notes after every blessing. He wrote with precision: age, color of hair, condition of teeth, reaction to heat. When one boy swayed and collapsed before the flame touched him, Silas only leaned closer, feeling his pulse before declaring it normal. He explained fainting was a sign of weak constitution, proof that the ritual was needed all the more. Ephraim, watching from the doorway, folded his arms and said the Lord favored obedience in all things. The ritual grew to be expected, even sought. Parents who feared storms sent their children to stand in Temperance's circle, convinced the smiling lights would shield their homes. The children returned pale, their lips dry and cracked, but their mothers said it was only proof the blessing had worked. Those who resisted were told they carried deceit in their mouths, that truth required pain to be sealed in. Over time, the fear of the flame dulled into something worse: acceptance. Children stopped flinching, stood still, pressed their lips shut as if already stitched. The wreath room smelled of lye and roses, the kitchen smelled of wax and cloves. Two crafts, one woman's and one man's, worked in harmony toward a single purpose. Silence shaped into obedience. The candles burned until nothing but the rings of teeth remained, grinning in the dark as if mocking what they had consumed. And each night after the circle ended, Temperance and Silas tucked away their molds and notes with the quiet satisfaction of work well done, leaving the house steeped in the faint echo of children's breath mingling with smoke. The storm rolled in from the river with a sound like 1,000 doors slamming at once, rattling shutters and bending the cedars along Stillwater Road. Families huddled inside their homes, whispering prayers against rising water. But in the Nash household, a long table had been set. Stew simmered on the stove, bread cooled on the counter, and a lantern burned steady despite the wind pushing at the windows. Brother Malachi North, a traveling preacher with a voice trained to soothe, had come just before the rain broke. He carried little more than a worn Bible and a hunger that made him grateful for the Nash's charity. He bowed his head at the table, praised the Lord for a house of order, and said that in times of storm the Lord blessed quiet homes most of all. Ephraim smiled at the words, pleased to hear his own creed echoed back from a man of the cloth. They ate while the thunder rolled, each spoon lifted only after Ephraim tapped his own against the bowl. Silence filled the gaps between strikes of lightning, the only sounds the scrape of wood on wood, the breath of mouths chewing, the hum of rain against the roof. Temperance ladled more stew with her usual gentleness, moving with the calm precision of someone who had practiced each gesture countless times. Brother Malachi remarked on the peace of the place, saying most homes were noisy with children, with quarrels, with distraction. He said God loved houses where order reigned, where no voice rose above another. Ephraim nodded, replying that obedience was the highest worship, and that even storms bent to it. After the meal, Ephraim invited the preacher to see his barn, a place he called the Hall of Rest. The lantern light swung across beams polished by years of care, across the neat rows of tools and stacked hay. But what caught the preacher's eye were the quilts, dozens of them piled against the far wall. Their patterns were plain, not the bright patchwork of neighbors' handiwork, but stitched with tight seams and weighted with strange heaviness. Ephraim lifted one with both hands, showing Brother Malachi the hidden river stone sewn into the lining. He explained they were rest quilts, used to teach the body stillness, to train limbs to lie obedient through the long night. He spoke of them as if they were instruments of health, saying a restless child beneath one would soon learn calm, would soon sleep without struggle, without sin. The preacher laid his hand upon one and felt its unnatural weight. He chuckled uneasily, saying the Lord works in many ways, and Ephraim took it as blessing. Temperance stood nearby, her hands folded, her face lit by the swaying lamp. She looked proud, as if the quilts were no different than the wreaths in her room or the candles in her kitchen. Each was part of a single order, a discipline that bound the household in silence and submission. The rain beat harder on the barn roof, drowning the fields, filling the air with the roar of water. Yet inside, all was still. Brother Malachi offered a final prayer for the house, thanking the Lord for quiet, for obedience, for the example set by Ephraim and his wife. He left with a full belly and the assurance that he had dined with saints. Behind him, the quilts waited in their piles, heavy as stone, ready to press against small chests and limbs until even storms could not wake them. The calf had broken loose from its pen during the wet spring morning, and Lydia Crane, already uneasy from weeks of restless nights, followed its small hooves through the sodden grass toward the Nash property. She called after it in a low voice, not wanting the family to hear her trespassing. Yet the animal did not slow, trotting straight toward the smokehouse that leaned at the edge of the yard. She had passed the place many times before on her way to school, always noting its tight-shut door and the way no smoke ever curled from its chimney. Today the calf stopped there, nosing at the ground, and as Lydia approached, she saw the door was ajar only by inches, as though waiting for her hand. Something in her body urged her back, but she was still clutching the school ledger where more names had disappeared, and she told herself perhaps there would be an answer here. Some plain thing to dispel her doubts. She pressed the door with her palm, and it swung open with the slow creak of swollen wood. The air struck her first, heavy and foul, thick with a sweet rancidness that seemed part lard, part rot, part roses left too long in water. The light of morning spilled in behind her and revealed what she wished she had never seen. Along the walls rose shelves stacked not with meat or herbs, but with jars. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, their glass fogged with congealed fat. Some held cloudy lumps that pressed against the glass like pale organs, others coils of hair twisted into ropes and floating as though alive. The jars glimmered faintly where the light touched them, and Lydia realized each was labeled with small tags written in Temperance's neat hand, initials followed by dates, ordered as carefully as school records. Her eyes dropped to the center table where slate boards were laid out in rows. Upon them sat teeth, small and white, arranged into careful tens. Some boards bore the neat stacks of molars, others the sharp points of canines, others the tiny milk teeth of children barely past their first lessons. Each row had been counted, marked with chalk, wiped clean, and counted again. She stepped closer in disbelief, her shoes scuffing the dirt floor, and saw that the teeth were not random trophies but measured collections, an inventory meant to be preserved. The fat in the jars gleamed like wax, and she understood with a lurch in her stomach that these were not scraps, but the makings of something ritual, something planned. Her heart pounded as she reached for one of the jars, unable to stop herself, as though proof was required for her mind to believe her eyes. The hair inside was bound tight in a braid, pressed into the fat until it seemed embalmed. She thought of the ribbons Temperance always tied, the blessings whispered by firelight, the faint smell of clove that never left the kitchen. Each act she had witnessed, hair taken, lips seared, quilts pressed heavy, suddenly wove into a single thread leading here to shelves of preserved silence. Then she heard it, a faint sound, not the settling of jars, not the shifting of beams, but the soft pull of air as though a breath had been drawn just behind her shoulder. Cold spilled down her arms as she froze, her hand still on the glass. She could not bring herself to turn. The breath came again, steady, almost patient, as if whoever or whatever stood behind her was in no hurry to be seen. The calf bleated from outside, the sound sharp and desperate, snapping her into motion. Lydia dropped the jar back to the shelf, stumbled for the door, and ran. She did not take the path, but cut through the undergrowth, branches clawing at her arms, mud soaking her skirts, her breath ragged in her throat. She did not look back, terrified of what face she might see in the dark of that room. When she reached the schoolhouse at last, her ledger clutched so tightly the cover was bent, she collapsed onto the step and wept. Until she could no longer hear the calf's cries, until the memory of the jars blurred into the pounding of her heart. But even as her body shook, she knew the image would not leave her. The cloudy fat, the ropes of hair, the neat white rows of teeth. She had opened a door that was not meant for her eyes, and though she escaped, the breath she felt on her neck followed her still, as if a piece of that hidden room had claimed her for its ledger. Mercy Nolan had once been known only as the quiet girl with the neat stitches, a seamstress who kept her eyes on the needle and her voice low enough to vanish into the hum of others' talk. In her youth, she had been taken into the Nash household as a helper, praised for her skill with thread and her willingness to work long hours in the wreath room. Temperance guided her hands at first, showing her how to loop hair into wreaths and braid strands into flowers. But soon Mercy was given more delicate tasks. She was instructed to twist the hair into long, fine cords, thinner than yarn but strong as wire, cords that could cut into skin if pulled tight. She was told they were for special wreaths, the kind only certain mourners requested, yet she never saw any of those wreaths delivered. Instead, the cords piled up, coiled into drawers labeled with initials. At night, she sometimes dreamed of mouths held shut, tongues pressed flat and hands bound close. She woke with her fingers aching as though she had tied knots in her sleep. She remained in the house until the evening she was called to receive a blessing. Temperance led her to the circle of candles, the smiling lights ringed with teeth. Silas stood by with his book of notes, and Ephraim prayed softly, the words more command than comfort. Temperance held a taper near her mouth and whispered that the flame would seal away lies. Mercy obeyed, leaning forward, but the fire was held longer than she expected. So close she felt her lips blister, the corners of her mouth seared with heat. She gasped, but Ephraim's hand on her shoulder pressed her still, and Silas wrote a line in his ledger without lifting his eyes. When the ritual ended, Temperance dabbed her skin with rose water, murmuring that scars were proof of obedience. That night, Mercy fled, clutching only her sewing kit, walking barefoot down the road until her feet bled. She never returned. For years she drifted between farms, keeping to shadows, sewing for food, never speaking of what she had seen. People thought her odd, her smile crooked and stiff, her voice hesitant, but they pitied her scars and left her to her work. She carried her silence like a burden, telling herself that speaking would only draw the Nashes back to her. But silence wears down the body, and when Deputy Jonah Bell came searching for answers years later, she could no longer hold the weight alone. He found her in a poorhouse near the county line, hunched over a quilt with her crooked mouth set in concentration. At first she would not meet his eyes, only whispered that nothing good came from questions. But Jonah pressed gently, asking her about the Nash household, about the hair cords she had sewn, about the scars at her lips. Her hands shook as she set down her needle. In a voice raw from disuse, she told him the cords were never for wreaths. They were made to bind. She had stitched them into thin ropes meant to hold children's wrists behind their backs, or to tie their tongues flat against splints so they could not cry out during what Ephraim called lessons. She said the cords cut deeper the longer they were tied, leaving mouths too swollen to speak and wrists marked with grooves that never healed clean. She spoke of drawers filled with labeled cords, each one kept after it had been used, the hair stiff with dried blood and saliva catalogued like trophies. She whispered that when she sewed, she tried to make the knots loose, tried to give small mercies, but temperance always checked her work, always pulled the cords taut to be sure. Jonah listened in silence, the weight of her words pressing into him heavier than any quilt. He asked why she had not spoken before, why she had carried this alone. Mercy's eyes filled with tears, the scars at her mouth pulling her face into something broken, and she said no one wanted to hear such things. That evil hidden behind prayers and wreaths was easier left buried. She wept as she told him that silence was what the Nashes had wanted most, and silence was what she had given them, even long after she had fled. When Jonah left the poorhouse that night, the air outside felt colder, the stars dimmer. He carried with him not just Mercy's testimony, but the echo of children bound in hair, the image of mouths sealed by fire and cord. He knew then that the graves on the hill were not the whole of it, that what lay beneath Stillwater Road was not only death, but the slow shaping of silence into obedience. And though Mercy had lived, her life was proof that survival was not escape, that some lessons burned too deep to fade. Jonah Bell returned to the Nash house with the weight of Mercy Nolan's words pressing on his chest like a stone. He did not come alone this time. At his side walked Judge Eliza Morton, a woman unshaken by whispers, her black dress heavy even in the heat, and behind them trailed two farmhands carrying crowbars and lanterns. The house on Stillwater Road stood too still, its shutters closed tight though the day was bright. The air inside smelled as it always had. Lye, roses, the faintest trace of cloves, as if nothing had changed, as if the Nashes had only stepped out for prayer. Yet every corner seemed to watch them as they crossed the rooms until they reached the place Jonah feared most, the wreath room. The shelves were still crowded with frames of hair, wreaths layered in dust, their patterns coiled like snakes waiting. The boards beneath their boots creaked with age. Judge Morton walked slowly along the shelves, her gloved fingers brushing nothing, her eyes taking in the silent testimony of loops and braids. One of the farmhands shifted his weight and the floor gave a sharp groan. Jonah felt it before he saw it. A plank shifting loose, the nail heads lifting like teeth from a jaw. He knelt, pried gently, and the boards snapped up with a dry crack. Beneath lay a hollowed space, dark and cold, where the earth had been scooped clean. They lowered a lantern and the light revealed what had been hidden too long. Ledgers stacked with care, their leather covers spotted with mildew but their bindings intact. Jonah lifted the top one, his hands trembling though his voice remained steady as he read. Each page was lined with columns written in Temperance's hand. Age, hair color, tooth count, date, hymn. The entries were neat, exact, the script unwavering even across years. They were not records of guests or mourners. They were inventories of children, of offerings catalogued with the cold discipline of account books. Judge Morton leaned close, her jaw tightening as Jonah turned the pages. In the margins of 22 entries, the same word appeared, written smaller, pressed deeper into the paper as though marked with finality. Quieted. No more, no less. Quieted. He read it aloud once, his voice barely above a whisper, and the sound seemed to drain the room of air. The farmhands crossed themselves, though neither spoke. Jonah closed the ledger, his palms slick with sweat, and looked at the judge. Eliza Morton said nothing, only nodded once, her eyes dark as the hollow beneath the boards. The meaning was plain. The graves on the hill had never been a mystery of chance nor the cruel work of nature. They were the end of a ledger kept in perfect order, a book that turned lives into lists and silence into proof. When they left the wreath room, Jonah nailed the board back down, though he knew no wood could cover what they had uncovered. Behind them, the hair wreaths hung in their frames, pale loops twisting in the lantern light as though moved by breath, as though mocking the living who had finally read the truth. The ledgers taken from beneath the wreath room floor were carried into town wrapped in cloth, as if the paper itself might sicken the men who held it. Judge Eliza Morton laid them before the county board in a meeting that stretched from daylight into candle hours. The air inside the chamber was heavy, not with the loud cries of accusation, but with the low hum of unease. Each page was examined, the columns of ages and colors and hymns read aloud until the words blurred into a rhythm of loss. The farmhands who had been present swore what they saw, but the county never summoned a jury. They said proof was lacking, that no bones had been uncovered, only hair and teeth and the quiet mark of a single word. And so what might have been a trial ended as something softer called a hearing, where the truth was spoken but not punished, laid out in full view only to be folded away again. By the time the ledgers were read into record, Ephraim Nash was already dead. Fever took him in his bed, sudden and hard, before he ever faced a question. Some called it divine judgment, others whispered poison, but no doctor signed a certificate to settle the matter. He was buried by dawn, no psalm sung, his grave marked only by a wooden stake hammered crooked into the clay. Temperance, left alone, attended one last church service a week later. Witnesses said she wore black lace and carried a prayer book, but did not bow her head once during worship. She left before the final hymn, stepping into the afternoon sun and between the churchyard and her home. She vanished. Some swore they saw her turn down the river path. Others said she stepped into a carriage that no one else remembered seeing. Search parties found no trace, only the faint smell of roses near the cedar grove by Stillwater. Her absence was explained in whispers, flight, murder, or worse, but no record was ever written. Yet the ledgers remained, and their weight could not be denied. Judge Morton carried them to Frankfurt herself, setting them before the State House with the same patience Temperance had once used to tie her ribbons. They became evidence not of a crime tried in court, but of a system forced to change. In 1873, the legislature passed new laws with little fanfare but lasting reach. Every home burial had to be registered, the name of the dead recorded alongside the time and place of interment. Dentists, even apprentices, were ordered to keep ledgers of extractions, each tooth accounted for as carefully as coin. And private schools, no matter how small, were required to report withdrawals with reason named, so that children could no longer vanish from ledgers as though erased by ink. The laws were passed without naming the Nash family, but everyone in the county knew their origin. They were called quietly the Stillwater Measures. On the hill behind Shady Grove, where the storm had opened the mounds, a marker was placed at last. It was no monument, only a stone slab set flush with the earth, carved with a single number. 22, no names, no ages, no dates, just the count. Mothers came and wept there, though they did not know which graves held their children or whether any body truly lay beneath the soil. Fathers laid stones from the riverbank in small piles, silent offerings to silence itself. At dusk, the wind shifted through the cedars, carrying the faint scent of lye and clove that seemed never to fade, no matter the season. Deputy Jonah Bell walked the hill often in the years that followed. He never told what Mercy Nolan had confessed, nor what Lydia Crane had seen in the jar room. But he carried both truths in his chest as if they were nails driven into his ribs. He knew justice had not been done, not in the way the law promised, but the ledgers had forced the world to look closer, to write down what could no longer be hidden. In the end, that was the only verdict given. The record itself, cold and exact, standing as testimony when the guilty had already gone. The house on Stillwater Road rotted in time, its windows broken by storms, its boards pried loose for firewood. Yet the ground never softened there. Children dared each other to cross the porch and claimed the air tasted bitter as soap. And each time rain fell, the number 22 darkened on the hillstone as if freshly carved. A reminder that even without a trial, the dead had left their mark. Years passed, and the house on Stillwater Road sagged into itself until only the frame remained, a husk of boards silvered by rain and sun. The family names faded from memory, spoken less with each generation, until Ephraim and Temperance became no more than rumors whispered by the old. Yet what they had left behind did not vanish. People remembered the wreaths more than the faces, the loops of hair pressed under glass, the circles that seemed to stare back with human softness. They remembered the candles ringed with teeth, flames that flickered in smiles where no laughter lived. They remembered the well that no longer drew water but once sang with voices that never returned. Objects endured, not the people who shaped them, and in those objects the story kept breathing. Children growing up in the county told each other that if you lit a candle and it did not smoke, you had called Temperance's blessing. If you placed a ribbon on your wall and it swayed without wind, you had been marked. School teachers warned pupils to write their names boldly, never in faint lines, for faint lines could be crossed away. Farmers avoided the hill after dark, claiming the cedar branches there hummed faintly like the low drone of hymns sung through clenched teeth. Few remembered who Jonas Pike was, or Mercy Nolan, or even Judge Morton. But the smell of lye, the sharp tang of clove, the memory of hair plucked and kept, those lingered like stains that water could not wash. Lydia Crane lived long enough to see the laws take hold, to watch ledgers filled more carefully, burials written into state record, children accounted for in ink. Yet even in her old age she kept a single relic from that time, the ribbon Temperance had pressed into her ledger. It hung by a nail above her desk, faded thin, the strands brittle with years. Sometimes she told herself she should burn it, but each time she tried, her hands failed. It remained a quiet witness, a strip of proof that order and cruelty can wear the same face. When she died, the ribbon passed to another teacher who did not know its weight, who saw only a keepsake tied by some forgotten hand. In that way it continued, drifting from house to house, a thread of memory disguised as ornament. Evil here had never shouted, never worn a mask of rage. It had been polite, clean, and patient. It spoke softly, offered bread, poured tea, prayed with folded hands. It stitched and counted, catalogued and arranged. It did not see children as lives, but as entries in a ledger. Teeth in rows, ribbons in drawers. It did not need violence in the open, it worked in silence, in the careful shaping of obedience. That was what made it endure. The ease with which it passed as care, the way it settled into trust before tightening its grip. As the film closes, the camera lingers on the ribbon in Lydia's old ledger, frayed but intact. The narrator's voice holds steady, low and unhurried. Evil here was not a storm, not a fire, not a thing that crashed through doors in the night. It was a hand that smoothed hair, a voice that promised safety, a candle that smiled without smoke. It was the order that comforted until it consumed. The question remains, heavy and unresolved. How do we guard against harm when it speaks like kindness, when it works in patience, when it wears the face of care? What do you think? Could this happen again?